This is America, Fog of War.
It's one of the real, I mean, you guys have hit on something that to me is one of the real cultural issues we have in this country these days. I mean, whether it was the Civil War where everybody knew somebody who was in, you were affected in different ways. Most cases, if you're in the South, you might have literally had the invading army camped in your backyard. Here in this area, not so much other than July, although Chambersburg was hit 3 times. But what we have today is there's this, instead of being, and even in World War II, everybody knew somebody and there was more of a we're all in this, where there was this broad-based not only support but contact with the military and the sacrifices that the military make. It is now what I would call much more vertical than horizontal. We have military families. I mean, my dad was a Korean War vet. My wife's dad was in Cold War. I was not in. By the time I got out, they were shedding people in 1975, 6, 7.
Right.
They wanted people out. But there's very little, as you note, this contact and understanding, because we tend to have military families that I said that are linear rather than a connection to everybody in the community.
Right.
And that's sad because, as you note, people don't understand the true sacrifices that are made. And we're losing that as a society, not just an understanding of it, but an appreciation of it and a gratitude for the service that people like the two of you have given. And it's a sad cultural issue, I think.
It is, and I blame it on the fact that we don't have any more kind of John Wayne genre movies. That's one of those things that is as corny as the good guy. The good guy's wearing spotless white cowboy outfit, but there is something about that connects your history also to a set of beliefs and ideals. And even the JFK quote, ask not what your country can do for you, ask instead what you can do for your country. Yeah. That whole thing can be reinforced in so many different ways. It's one of the goals of this podcast is to reignite that, because again, also that is tied into there's a guy named Sebastian Junger.
I'm familiar with him.
Okay, he did the Restrepo documentaries and all that. He's got a book called Tribe. Have you ever read it?
I've not read that one. I've read a lot of his others though.
He's a great author, and this book Tribe, in a multitude of different ways, covers this concept that he was running into. He had checked back in with the guys from Restrepo. This is like a year or two after they had been back, and many of them had gotten out. And he kept asking them, how they were doing, and they were all pretty miserable, and they all, for the most part, were saying they wish they could go back, right? And part of that is the purpose aspect, I believe.
When I was young, I had a mentor figure in my life named Ellis. He was half Lakota Sioux, half Apache. At one point when I was young, he said, it's funny, all throughout the history of this country, along the frontier, white people were always running off to join us Indians, but we Indians never ran off to join the white people. He said there was something about tribal society that even though it existed in the natural world, that these were hunter-gatherers, they lived tough lives, there was something about tribal society that was incredibly appealing, even to people from modern society that enjoyed the benefits of modern society. Decades later, I was a war reporter, and I found myself at a remote outpost called Restrepo. And there were 20 guys on this hilltop. They were completely cut off from the world. They had no internet, telephone lines, no electricity. They slept shoulder to shoulder in the dirt, and they were endured an enormous amount of combat for 15 months. When they came back to Vicenza, Italy, where they're based, I caught up with them a few months later, and as you can imagine, they had some pretty good parties planned for when they got back to Vicenza, but after that wore off, something else set in. As odd as this sounded, they wanted to go back to Restrepo. And suddenly I remembered Ellis. I remembered what he said about the frontier, and it occurred to me, what is it about modern society which is so hard to come home to? And I realized a platoon in combat actually recreates our evolutionary past incredibly well. What happens with soldiers is that they experience the communality of our past incredibly intensely. And then we pick these people up and we drop them down in the great American suburb. The interesting thing about humans is the worse things get, the better people act. The first war that I covered was Sarajevo. in the Bosnian Civil War. I recently talked to a woman who survived that. She was badly wounded. She literally lowered her voice and said to me, you know, the funny thing is, we all missed the war because we were better people. We looked out for each other. We were more generous. We acted better.
Sebastian Junger also makes this point that up to a very recent time in our history, if there was a war on, your grandfather had been in a war, your dad had been in a war, your brothers had probably been in a war, your mom was working in a factory down the road to support the war, your pastor had been to war, or in some way was affected by the efforts that your country was making in a war. And so everybody, when you come back from combat at that time, it's a little easier to integrate back into the populace because they get it. Like the same things that are important to you are going to be important to them, right? You don't get held up on all this small stuff, this very much first world kind of issues. You really have a firm grasp that is shared among just about everybody of what the important things are and what you should be concerned over and what you shouldn't be concerned over. And there's a tribal sense to that. Nowadays, you don't have that because of, like you said, it's more, instead of being linear, it's up the graph instead of horizontal across the graph.